such a cool title, called Quakers, Race and Empire, the Politics of Civic Membership in U.S. Insular Policy Rhetoric, 1898 to 1917. And this book will provide an historical analysis of U.S. Quaker interventions into national political debates as well as other things from the early 20th century. Today, we are getting a sneak preview of this book. So please welcome Dr. Figueroa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yale, and for your hospitality this morning as well, picking me up in the airport. Not getting a wake-up call, so I was panicking. Just rushing through. Don as well, who did a nice job driving us here safely as well. And Monty as well, who I had email exchanges through the Gainesville Quaker meeting. So basically, as Gail mentioned, I am hoping to expand my audience, as you can see, moving away from the traditional academic conference setting and hoping to get some feedback, some additional questions and comments from those in other disciplines, and this is one of the best places to do so. I come via a colleague of mine, Wade Pigrin, who was a student of Don at UF many years ago, who's currently the director of the Center for Faculty Excellence at Ithaca College. So he and I are colleagues, and I mentioned my interest in spreading this project, and he said, "Oh, I may have a place for you." I said, "Okay, well, thank you," and then everything started from there. So this is basically part of a chapter in a sense. It's also part of a journal article that will be coming out soon through the Journal of Race and Policy. So I'll be drawing from that. My idea is to provide some basic background on U.S. insular policy and what that means, and then work our way into early 20th century debates within the Quaker-founded Lake Mohawk Conference that was held in upstate New York from the late 19th century through the beginning of the 20th century. So this is my period. So basically a captured audience of historical actors that I'm working with. I did my dissertation work at Haverford College, so I was there the Quaker collection, so those are my circles. Swarthmore, Haverford, among other places. But here I want to focus on the case of Puerto Rico, early 20th century. As you may or may not know, Puerto Rico has become part of the national scene once again, not only because of the economic crises there with high unemployment, many fiscal problems, but also the return of the status question in terms of its relationship with the U.S. government and the economy. So this is part of so it's timely, which is great when you are working on a project for such a long time, and all of a sudden, it becomes timely. So this is fantastic, and I'm hoping to carry this momentum into the bigger project moving forward. So here I want to just provide some background in terms of the territorial status question, and then work my way into reading some text from the actual ongoing book project, and getting as I always say, the historical actors speak for themselves. This is the rich data that I work with are from the archives, and it's very timely as well. When you hear the language, it almost seems that they are talking about today, 21st century, and it's the early 20th century. So the debate is ongoing. So this is what I'm going to do, and then hopefully we'll have a nice exchange, more into the Q&A and exchanges and conversation than just lecturing. So looking forward to that as well. So I want to thank you for coming this morning. I know you're competing with other things around town, graduations and other things. So we'll just get started here. This is a Prezi, by the way. This is something new that I just started learning in this past summer. So I'm figuring out how to do these things. Okay, so the basic idea of Puerto Rico and the territorial status issue, as I mentioned here, it's basically a doctrine that was developed through the Supreme Court. Several cases, 23 Supreme Court cases that were handed down between 1901 and 1922, provided the justification in a sense, or some would say there is no justification for the creation of this doctrine, meaning the doctrine of territorial incorporation, but also the subsequent category, the unincorporated territories, which is where Puerto Rico sits as unincorporated in terms of the Constitution as a territory. And this happened soon after the 1898 Spanish-Cuban American War. So as the U.S. acquired certain territories overseas, they began to ask the question, where does the flag follow the Constitution? Or what do we do with these territories in terms of the framework that was laid out in the Constitution for its territorial clause? So here, the Supreme Court begins to engage this question. It was all based on issues of tariff, of taxes. This works. So the phrase that many have held on to was uttered by, as you can see, by Justice Edward Douglas White in the first major case in Downs versus Bidwell, where he said that Puerto Rico, among other territories, and they are listed right below that, Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Virgin Islands, and American Samoa, are foreign in a domestic sense. So this is the phrase that was then used to justify it. So they are foreign in a domestic sense. So here, of course, meaning that they are territories of the U.S., but they are not part of the U.S., if that makes sense. So then these are the characteristics that all of these territories have different relationships in terms of the territorial status, but they do have commonalities, and these are the commonalities here that I listed. Congress still maintains what's called governing authority, again pursuant to the power under the territorial clause, and it was deeply justified through the Supreme Court cases. None is either sovereign or part of the Union, so they do have autonomous spaces. They can govern themselves, but overseen by the U.S. Congress. So Congress is basically the ultimate sovereign in this case. C, those born there are U.S. citizens, except for American Samoa. They are U.S. nationals, so they have even less rights than those who are U.S. citizens on the island, who are limited in terms of rights. D, all are affected by federal measures. That's sole discretion, should be an S, discretion of Congress. So basically anything that is produced in Washington that deals with the territories, there is no voice in terms of dissent, for instance, or trying to change or repeal this process. None have representation at the federal level. There is a resident commissioner who sits in the House of Representatives in terms of Puerto Rico, but does not have a vote. So it's more advisory, it's almost pleading on the floor of Congress. If you've seen, watch it on C-SPAN, if you get a chance. Make sure you bring some popcorn on C-SPAN and the U.S. Congress. So here, now, putting that in context, and I'll come back to that as I integrate again, I'm doing multiple things here for the first time. I'm trying to bring in the insular cases into the broader engagement of Quakers as well. So Quakers have had a history in engaging in social justice politics, but there has not been a close reading or an integrating of their role in early 20th century insular politics. And this is why I'm trying to bring this out more. In the larger project, I need to tease out more of the connections that I'm making, because I'm limited in terms of time here. I'm going to focus on the debates that were being held here in the early 20th century at the Lake Mohawk Mountain House. And this is in New Paltz, New York. As you can see, it's very beautiful. It's a resort as well, so it's a place that attracts various individuals, from celebrities, politicians, intellectuals. Back then, it attracted statesmen, it attracted intellectuals. John Dewey attended, Carnegie attended, we had Teddy Roosevelt attended some of these meetings, from Lyman Abbott as well, and various dignitaries from the territories, or those who were intellectual or elites at those territories who were basically brought up by, and I will share that in a few minutes, by the Smiley family, who were Hicksite Quakers, educated at Haverford, but they were also part of the Quaker scene in upstate New York. So we'll get into this. Let me show you a picture of Albert Smiley. This is Albert K. Smiley. He's the founder of the Lake Mohawk Conference. So what I want to do is now engage in some of the aspects of the talk, the more academic, historical aspects of the talk, but I want to put that in context. So basically, the talk this morning is focusing on, as Gail mentioned, Quaker political interventions between the Figueroa Act of 1900, and I'll go into that, what that means, and the Jones Act of 1917. So it's about a 17-year period where the Quaker Lake Mohawk Conference was engaging not only Puerto Rico, but other debates, international debates, foreign policy, for instance. I will do so focus on the shaping of insular policy debates over the extension of U.S. citizenship to those on the island, and also in terms of self-governance, trying to create institutions, liberal institutions on the island to provide more autonomy in the hopes of moving forward, if not independence, but statehood. So this was the rhetoric that was taking place even in the early 20th century, that if you begin to read the newspapers today, it still continues. So the rhetoric continues. So my contention here is basically that the LMC Quakers, in their pursuit in terms of liberal egalitarian outcomes, accepted the dominant and divisive Christian racialist assumptions of the times, producing some unintended consequences in terms of the development of U.S. insular policy. So you can see this playing out. So this is why the title of it is Quakers, Race, and Insular Policy. So this plays out in these discussions. So here's a quote from the founder. It's kind of lengthy, but parts of it is him addressing the 19th Annual Conference of Friends of the Indian, basically letting the members know that we have now acquired other dependent peoples, and we need to engage the question again about the status. What do we do with these people, the territories, and how do we provide improved conditions on the ground? So basically use the conditions argument. Improving conditions, moving them into closer to what the U.S. was at that time in terms of characteristics, national characteristics. So as you can see, he says, ladies and gentlemen, the time has arrived for the 19th Annual Conference of the Friends of the Indian. I am not sure, but we shall have to change that name. which he does later on, that becomes a debate in itself. What do you mean by dependent people? And that became a hot topic for those who were in Puerto Rico. He says, I cannot begin to tell you how much pleasure it gives me to welcome you here, to see a company of men and women. Again, this also reflects these Quaker sensibilities with the place of women in these kinds of institutions, because again, this is prior to the women's, this is at the heart of the women's suffrage movement, let me put it this way, before the 20th Amendment. To see a company of men and women with earnest hearts and clear minds, clear brains, coming together to discuss the elevation of different races of people and the best way of doing it is to me an intense delight. I believe all good causes can be best promoted by the friendly, earnest, open discussion of people holding different views, comparing notes, and then arriving at some conclusion. We have always had open and free discussion here, and at the end, we have come to some conclusion in which we can agree, owing to the fact that there were peacemakers as well as wise heads among us. And then he continues, I have great hopes for the success of this conference. There are here this morning just an even 100 invited guests, with about 50 yet to come. There are 231 regular guests of the house, also here an unusual number at this time of the year. I am afraid that we may have to put our conference off later on in the year, because we do not like to turn away people who want to attend it. And the critical point is at the end here, it has been thought best that the Indian question should not monopolize the whole 3 days of the meeting. A great many matters which needed attention 18 years ago have been settled now, so that the need of an Indian conference is not so strong as it was. But other questions have come up which are very important, such as Puerto Rico, that was the spelling at the time, P-O-R-T-O, R-I-C-O, the Philippines, and Hawaii, about which ought to confer and time, we ought to confer and time will be given for that. So this is how he laid it out in 1901. So here there are some guiding questions that I want to, that frame this talk and this particular piece that I am presenting, as you can see. So what led Quakers to intervene, engage in U.S. Puerto Rico policy discourses in the early 20th century? The second, to what extent did these Quaker political interventions contribute to legitimating collective citizenship in Puerto Rico? And third, related to the second, in what sense did Quakers during this period reconcile the competing political visions regarding Puerto Rico's place within an expanding U.S. imperialist state? So, this is the main claim that I am making here and hoping to develop. So again, I contend that the LMC Quakers, in their pursuit of liberal egalitarian outcomes, accepted the dominant and divisive Christian racialist assumptions of the times, producing some unintended consequences in terms of the development of U.S. policy toward Puerto Rico that still resonate today. This is part of the, I'm trying to make an argument that we can trace current political dynamics to early 20th century discussions at these conferences that were hosted by the more liberal progressive Quakers at the time. And some of these consequences that we saw then and that have lingering effects today descended among Puerto Rican delegates at the LMC that strained the broader U.S. Puerto Rico affairs. The second, a decline in Quakers' political influence in insular policy development. And third, increased likelihood for an ascriptive and egalitarian form of political membership, which is what you saw in 1917, the statutory collective U.S. citizenship that was granted to those on the island. So as opposed to 14th Amendment form of citizenship that most, if not all, who were born in the current 50 states are considered. So this is the background. So I will do a little bit of reading and contextualizing. I'm going to open it up for discussion. So of course there is a consensus among scholars that 1898 was a critical moment in the development of modern US imperialism. That year witnessed the end of a decisive, brutal, yet short victory for the US in the Spanish-Cuban-American War. And of course the exponential growth of the US imperialist state at the time. The Treaty of Paris was immediately signed, placing a previously autonomous Puerto Rico under complete US political and constitutional governing authority. Within this context, US Puerto Rico policy became part of much larger national political debates over organizing acquired and unincorporated overseas territories, and establishing or inventing a form of civic status for non-white dependent peoples under US sovereign rule. So I'm referring to those insular cases that were being pronounced over the same period of time. These debates centered on Puerto Rico's proper fit within a US polity characterized in both Anglo-Saxon, meaning white, nationalist terms on the one hand, on the other hand as a nation of immigrants. So you have this interesting dichotomy. A nation of immigrants, but then you have a notion of national identity that's rooted in the whiteness at the time. And then you acquire territory of people who are non-whites, some of them non-Christian, so then you have to deal with all these dynamics at the same time. So at the center of these national debates, however, were liberal, more progressive Quakers who collaborated with both American and Puerto Rican social and political elites in restructuring US Puerto Rico policy. And this meant granting collective citizenship, understood as bestowing liberal and Republican political rights to, again, non-white races, and establishing democratic institutions and practices on the island. Liberal Quakers were extolled by American political leaders for guiding controversial political national debates, but were critiqued by others, in particular some liberal Puerto Ricans who wanted more, for accepting the dominant Christian racialist norm underwriting US Puerto Rico policy that again was coming out of the US Congress. These critiques eventually served to limit Quakers' influence on US Puerto Rico affairs more broadly. So here I hope to show how these Quaker political interventions afforded US politicians and others, Quaker and non-Quaker alike, an opportunity to reconceptualize the notions of collective citizenship and self-rule while settling seemingly irreconcilable ideological tensions between liberal democratic means on the one hand and illiberal non-democratic outcomes, such as the statutory citizenship as an outcome that is still being questioned in terms of how does that fit the Constitution. So I also hope to illustrate how these mostly liberal Quakers were complicit in the ways ascriptive inegalitarian forms of political membership were negotiated as well, and how they were reached through what I call political ecumenism. So here are the key points that I'm laying out. The first one here, as I just mentioned, Quaker political interventions in this policy area, affording US political figures at least a chance to reconceptualize, to rethink what it means to be a citizen if you are from an overseas territory, and what it means to self-rule if you are not incorporated into the Constitution. And of course, the second point I just mentioned, most of the Quakers were complicit in the ways ascriptive inegalitarian forms of political membership were negotiated and reached through what I call political ecumenism. Basically, this ascriptive inegalitarian form is a concept that Roger Smith from the University of Pennsylvania has been writing about. It's basically looking at the way government authorities, the way individuals who have control over resources can basically ascribe an identity on populations, on individuals. And they could be based on arbitrary aspects such as skin color, gender, class. So ascription could be based on anything at this point. So here it's based on, again, the non-white and Christian. So non-Christian, so you identify people, you ascribe an identity that then ties into the type of civic status that they will be provided. So this is the interesting relationship with that. And of course this is done in various ways. So I give you my conception of political ecumenism here. I mean a constitutive dialogic process where individuals engage, again these are the conferences, in conference, in discursive practices guided by the Quaker peace testimony and the discernment principle for achieving universal assent among competing political visions and policy statements. So here, the space is founded on some of the traditional Quaker testimonies, humanitarianism, egalitarianism, peace, and also the discernment principle is there, meaning that you're not looking for agreement, you're looking for a sense of what it is that those within the meeting are getting out of that meeting, basically. This idea that you can sense, and of course here the political aspect of it is trying to politicize this process, and they try to do that, so it's hard to do that, to rationalize this process, but they did this there, try to politicize and rationalize something that is not rational, it's spiritual. But this is why I try to bring this in. They try to engage the spiritual, the secular, into the political, competing political visions. So try to make sense of what those in the meeting were hoping to get out of those meetings in terms of political status and what I just mentioned, the U.S. political policy. The third aspect that grows out of the broader argument is the notion of collective citizenship, as these debates over U.S. political policy show, reminds us how often political leaders ascribe, again, certain inegalitarian forms of political identities or civic statuses to those deemed other, while staying within seemingly liberal Republican rhetoric and democratic institutional arrangements. And this is done in several ways, as I said. One other way is the setting of myths or telling of stories that populations then have to buy into. So it's basically the American dream. These are some of the ways that politicians, even today, you see the pundits and the rhetoric that's used, but here it was more so. You acquire territory, you have to decide what to do with them, what to do with people, and then you begin to create a narrative, a liberal narrative. You will gain equality, freedom, certain rights, as long as you meet certain conditions moving forward. And the conditions are defined, again, in a narrow sense, as I mentioned before, in this balance between we're a nation of immigrants, but we also are mostly Anglo-Saxon sensibilities. So it's this interesting dynamic there that clashes with the insular policy cases. So that leads me to, in a few minutes I will engage with Luis Munoz Rivera, who was one of the major figures in Puerto Rico at the time. He is one of the, in a sense, the founding figures of what Puerto Rico is today. In a sense, his son was the one who negotiated in 1947-1952 Commonwealth status that currently governs the island. So there's a long lineage there with Rivera, Munoz Rivera family. So let me just begin with trying to connect these various pieces, and then I'll bring in Munoz Rivera. So beginning in 1904, Quakers at the LMC, the Lake Mohawk Conference, called for collective U.S. citizenship in Puerto Rico. This was considered a first step toward building stronger political and economic ties between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. Quakers began to urge the U.S. Congress to consider granting native Puerto Ricans citizenship almost as a moral imperative, if not political right, to civic membership. Quakers produced LMC institutional platforms, so at the end of these meetings, platforms were produced that were then sent to members of Congress, to public libraries, in terms of what they stood for. In this case, was promoting U.S. citizenship for the Puerto Rican population. So these platforms did that while also suggesting various economic development programs designed to modernize a people on the island. This gesture illustrated the inherent social gospel spirit of political and economic reforms at the LMC, in that it encouraged improvements on forestal services, for instance, and also irrigation systems. So they were also engaging modernization debates, how to bring them up to speed in terms of modernization. The main concern, however, was a collective citizenship that instituted Anglo-Protestant Christian notions of civic education in Puerto Rico in preparation for more territorial autonomy in the near future. In 1910, Albert K. Smiley, the founder of the LMC, officially revealed his interest in U.S. Puerto Rico policy as providing, quote, a strictly nonpartisan platform from which may be heard voices representing all phases of Puerto Rico affairs, end quote. Nevertheless, issues arose regarding the reach and perhaps the impact of the LMC in this area, in this policy area. Conference Secretary H.C. Phillips, also a Quaker, wrote to prominent Puerto Rican leader Jose de Diego in the summer of 1913 that U.S. Puerto Rican policy had been under discussion for several years and that, quote, they have been favored by the presence of several representative Puerto Ricans, end quote. Moreover, since Puerto Rican participation had remained consistent, especially between 1904 and 1910, and the LMC was taken seriously by both U.S. political officials and native Puerto Ricans there, because, quote, the conference had been able to exert considerable influence in favor of congressional action providing for the citizenship of Puerto Ricans, end quote. But then Phillips pointed out that because they were not strong enough or persuasive enough, it became more difficult for those on the island to make the trip to upstate New York, especially in October. Imagine you're coming from the Caribbean, making the trip, pre-airplanes, up to the channel or the Atlantic Pond, as they say, going all the way up and enduring harsh winters, among other things, and not being heard the way they wanted to be heard. So here, in trying to find a solution to the Puerto Rican participation problem while also increasing the significance of the LMC in this policy area, Phillips suggested several things. Quote, with similar legislation still pending and the approaching conference coming shortly before the next Congress, it would seem doubly important this year to have a strong delegation from Puerto Rico. For obviously the influence of a conference like this is in direct proportion to the participation of those most deeply concerned. I am sure you still appreciate the nature of the situation and that you will make every practicable effort to promote the success of the Puerto Rican program at Mohawk this fall, end quote. This was a letter that he wrote to Jose de Diego. Phillips pointed to the important role the LMC had already played, as you can see, yet he did not propose any changes to the institutional provisions that seemed to limit full Puerto Rican participation in the Mohawk meetings. Instead, Phillips relied on a, quote, laissez-faire approach to this issue by providing the Puerto Rican delegates the freedom to select whomever they desired as speakers. Thus, the success of the LMC's gradualist strategy, which is consistent with some of the past strategies used by more social justice conscious Quakers, from the anti-slavery sentiment through the Negro question and moving forward through the labor and civil rights politics of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, is engaging certain policies through a gradualist approach, piecemeal, or an immediate, let's cut to the chase, let's make sure that we provide those who are deemed unequal some equality, some resources. So this is consistent with that, those strategies. So basically the success of the LMC's gradualist strategy in terms of U.S. Puerto Rico policy development was placed on the shoulders of the Diego and the Puerto Rican delegation, including, I'll get to Luis Muñoz Rivera, without them being apprised of the politics and implications of whatever approach they might take. So that was the pressure from there. Now I want to move forward to one of the key figures who made strong statements about the role of the LMC and what he expected from the Quaker-founded institution in terms of this policy area. So in 1911, at the LMC, Puerto Rico resident commissioners of the U.S. House of Representatives and Puerto Rican Union Party leader Luis Muñoz Rivera, who you see up here, presented a more nuanced account of the main points surrounding U.S. Puerto Rico policy. Questioning the rhetoric of U.S. liberal democratic idealism that was being played out in the Congress and the U.S. Capitol, which was different than the rhetoric that was provided on the island. His close ties to elected officials in both the U.S. and Puerto Rico and expansive knowledge of American history served him well at the LMC. Muñoz Rivera illuminated the deep hypocrisy that he saw behind the liberal, racial, religious rhetoric of U.S. government officials without experiencing any significant backlash. So he was allowed, because this was a space that Quakers provided for all kinds of voices and even critiques of the U.S. government, which it would have been very difficult for him to appear before the U.S. Congress, for instance, on the floor. Even though he tried several times, but it would have been more difficult there than he experienced at the LMC. In short, he exposed the presumption of Christian Anglo-Saxon, again meaning white, racial superiority at the national level. Muñoz Rivera, through his historical narrative and political discursive powers, kind of deracinated, uprooted the problematic presumptions, right? And at that time, white supremacy was being used again and again, late 19th century, early 20th century. So he's exposing this as a presumption that's problematic. If you are talking about liberal democracy, but then underlying this whole discussion is this idea, this ideology. Guiding the so-called Americanization campaign in Puerto Rico. So his 1911 speech revealed an almost intimate understanding of Quaker values, pursuit of truth, through candor, open dialogue. For example, as Muñoz Rivera framed U.S. Puerto Rico policy in moral and historical terms. So if you will allow me to read his text, or parts of it as we go along, and hopefully you can see the richness and the boldness that he was allowed to use in this space. So here he is. We must tell you the truth. Again, the pronoun we, he's representing the island here. We must tell you the truth, harsh or sweet as it may be, but always the truth. And it is our duty to tell you that we are not satisfied with our political status. While we long to be free, we are compelled to support the tutelage of a government in the organization of which our votes play no part. We are not satisfied because wishing to be American citizens, national citizenship is argued and denied us. Civilization began its work in Puerto Rico long before it manifested itself in the United States. Our life as an organized society dates back over 400 years. Our origin is to be found in a race of explorers and pioneers whose footsteps remain heroically printed everywhere they went, from south to north, from west to east, right in this nation of yours. There may be heard the Latin names of cities and territories: Florida, Montana, California, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, are words left here by our ancestors. Tampa, San Antonio still remain baptism names of the colonial times. Of course, colonial times of the Spanish rule. The seed of Christianity was scattered in America by Father Las Casas in times more remote than those of William Penn. Yet, the contention is made that on account of our presumed incapacity, we are not entitled to the liberal autonomy which is your happiness to enjoy, or to the exercises of the self-government practiced by yourselves. So that's part of his speech. So here, Muñoz Rivera contended that Puerto Ricans have the capacity for civic self-rule and thus the cultural wherewithal of collective citizenship, and the acumen for upholding both liberal and republican government. His appeal and knowledge of North American continental history, especially of the Christian influences of Spanish conquistador de las Casas, prior to the creation of the U.S. colonies, and subsequent role of Quaker William Penn in founding of the country, legitimized his presence at the LMC meetings, well beyond the norm of so-called local expertise. They would provide spaces for local experts to hear those who were being affected by policies on the ground to come and engage Congress members and intellectuals and poets and what have you. So here, he was beyond that. He was not only an intellectual, he was in politics, he was aware of history. So this is a good figure to bring everything together here. So in a systematic way, Muñoz Rivera defended civic republican citizenship in Puerto Rico by showing how the U.S. had recognized other countries. This comes later. He begins to make comparisons with other countries that were accepted as political equals with less resources and less, how did he frame it? He was trying to make a point that even though there was a high rate of illiteracy on the island, there was more high rates of illiteracy on other, in other places like France and at that time. So how can you use that as a basis to not see us as equal? So he basically refuted unfounded assertions made by Americans about the negative social, economic, political consequences resulting from a demand for increased civic local autonomy beyond that granted by the Foraker Act. Muñoz Rivera also challenged the implicit racial hierarchies that lay behind arguments linking high illiteracy rates to a political capacity for self-government. Not uncommon, the illiteracy political capacity thesis was used frequently by imperialists and also anti-imperialists for different reasons at the time to deny home rule to non-white populations. Yet it was not only used by the so-called Anglo-centric U.S. Congress that he saw, but also by the Puerto Rican Executive Council established by the Foraker Act in 1900. Muñoz Rivera was well situated in both institutions, allowing him to be well informed on these positions. His critical speech illuminated, again, the ascriptive and egalitarian elements behind the U.S. Puerto Rico policy. And of course, he goes through an argument, again, laying out these percentages when he compares Puerto Rico having 60% illiterate, the illiterate rate of 60%, and he says, on what grounds are the assertions made by those who uphold such judgments? Are they founded on the fact that the population of Puerto Rico has 60% illiterates? If so, I would request you to convey your mind to the year 1776, to recall if the United States, when their independence was declared, did not have a greater percentage of illiteracy. Now, in our own days, according to the last statistics, these percentages of illiteracy are to be found among the following nations: Romania, 80%, Portugal, 79%, Mexico, 76%, Russia, 73%, Serbia, 64%, Spain, 64%, Italy, 64%. It is not to be supposed that anybody would advise the disappearance of these nations or argue their political incapacity because of their illiteracy. And notwithstanding, all of them should be considered on that point as inferior to Puerto Rico. Their diplomatic representatives are accepted by you, their ministers are treated as your equal, reciprocity treaties are concluded with their governments, and you recognize their sovereignty. It should not be forgotten, Cuba lived, as did Puerto Rico, developed itself as Puerto Rico, suffered the same misfortune as Puerto Rico, grew on conditions identical to those in Puerto Rico. There is a single title to which Cuba could boast, to which Puerto Rico cannot refer, having supported with their rifles in the mountains their protest, while the Puerto Ricans sustained their claim and protest from the tribune, the press, and by means of their books. That is to say, with speech and with their hands. So they did not fight what the Cubans did. They're saying that maybe we should have, in his own way. If this is also a charge against us, I would ask that it be plainly made so that my countrymen and myself should learn from the promotion of liberty that liberty is only brought at the price of blood on the altar of supreme sacrifices. Very dramatic. Muñoz Rivera again used his discursive rhetorical power to make a distinction between violent revolution and non-violent strategies in the pursuit of liberty. In his argument, he focused on the lower 60% literacy rate rather than the conventional 80% or higher figure cited by most U.S. officials for often ideological, if not racialist purposes that he later reiterates in the U.S. Congress. So he made a similar speech in the U.S. Congress, a little more guarded in a sense. The use of 80% or higher rate was common at the time. For example, almost 5 years prior to Muñoz Rivera's comments at the LMC, Lyman Abbott, a Congregationalist, who was not a Quaker, but he was accepted in many of the positions of power within the LMC. He was a well-known Christian evolutionary racialist and former president of the LMC, asserted, quote, we need not expect the work of tutelage of a population of 85% illiterate and with a government that was bankrupt in every direction to be a popular task, nor one that will bring us gratitude in return, except from the few who are intelligent and capable, until the whole mass is raised educationally to a point where free institutions and honest, impartial administration can be appreciated by those whose traditional history, 400 years, tells us nothing of these things. End quote. That was Hammock claiming this. So his claim was considered by Muñoz Rivera as one of the more egregious and unfounded utterances by a public official, obstructing Puerto Rican delegates' policy work at the LMC. Hence, at this critical juncture in U.S. Puerto Rico policy development, the LMC was, in a larger sense, complicit in a way, obstructing Puerto Rican delegates' work by allowing Abbott to address members, so basically clashing, and the American people, while knowing full well that his problematic racialist positions would later constrain U.S. Puerto Rico affairs. So it's this back and forth process that was very dynamic. Okay. So this is rich material. I get excited and I can stand here for the next 3 hours. Just try to get some of the gist. Let's see. I'm prepared. So let me at least summarize and open it up to Q&A and we maybe get at some of the other issues. Again, this is a project that's bringing in many aspects, and I didn't get into too much of the Quaker component here. It's but it's there. We can open it up to Q&A, and the other race theories of the 19th century that is also kind of underlying debates here. And of course, the policy perspective, which is very consistent with what's happening today in terms of Puerto Rico. So let me just conclude and then open it up, hopefully. Early 20th century liberal Quakers, through the non-governmental institutional work of the LMC, engaged in a gradualist approach to U.S. political policy reform that attracted conservatives, liberals, imperialists, anti-imperialists alike, women and men of all places. Quakers at the LMC viewed gradualism as the most effective way to promote collective citizenship for Puerto Ricans, yet to the increased dissatisfaction of several key members of the Puerto Rican delegation to these yearly meetings. Quakers hoped that through a systematic yearly conference-to-conference process and with the inclusion of, quote, expert testimonies from well-situated Puerto Rican leaders, several positive outcomes would result on U.S. Puerto Rico policy development beyond the limited Foraker Act. The Foraker Act, which I may have failed to mention, established U.S.-style liberal civilian government. So it was the first attempt of organizing the island mirroring what the states look like, in a sense, except there was no elected governor until the mid-20th century. So it was still appointed. It could have been someone from Congress, one of the party members, Republican or Democrat party member, who may or may not have spoken Spanish. So he was then appointed as the governor of the island. So that was this is why the limitations of the Foraker Act in terms of bringing them to liberal democratic experiences. And then the Jones Act of 1917 extended the citizenship rights to Puerto Ricans and started democratizing the institutions even more, allowing for local elections. But full democratization on the island itself did not happen until the again, 20th century, 1947, 1952. So here you have the LMC trying to engage this process between those two legislations. However, these Quakers advocated solely for collective citizenship, a condition that was illiberal in nature, while not taking seriously the home rule demands of Puerto Rican political leaders. Many of these included prominent politicians, for example, Luis Muñoz Rivera and José de Diego, among others, who claimed Quakers did not go far enough in their intervention despite the conference's political ecumenist aims and practices. Quakers were ineffective in this policy area at or unable to challenge the racialist assumptions structuring the national debates over the extension of citizenship in Puerto Rico because of a strict adherence to So they were limited because of the strict adherence to institutional rules of decision-making rooted in traditional Quaker notions of peace and universal intent. As a result, Puerto Rican leaders eventually lost confidence in the ability of the LMC to effectuate policy change. The LMC acted to consolidate, in the broader sense, the U.S. imperialist state's governing authority over Puerto Rico and the management of its non-white peoples. Through its political ecumenism, the non-governmental institution ironically afforded a racialized and marginalized people in Puerto Rico the public recognition to obtain collective citizenship under U.S. imperialist rule. Nevertheless, the political and rhetorical debates and policy discourses at the LMC in the years between 1900 Foraker Act and the Jones Act of 1917 informed and shaped positive public opinion toward Puerto Rico before reaching its peak by October 1916. A few months later, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Jones Act in March of 1917 that eliminated the vacuous citizen of Puerto Rico political category while granting statutory collective citizenship to island residents. However, despite these reforms and subsequent legal constitutional changes in 1947, allowing for the first popular democratically elected Puerto Rican governor, and in 1952 establishing home rule through Commonwealth status, millions of Puerto Rican islanders still lack 1, a voting representative in the U.S. Congress, 2, the franchise during U.S. presidential elections, 3, electoral votes within the Electoral College. As Jorge Duani states, quote, although the United Nations officially removed Puerto Rico from its list of colonies in 1953, the island's political status has been intensely contested in international forums, as well as in the U.S. Congress and in Puerto Rico itself. The federal government retains jurisdiction over most state affairs, including citizenship, immigration, customs, defense, currency, transportation, communications, and foreign trade. End quote. More recently, a political status referendum was held in Puerto Rico, November 2012, where the residents of the island were asked 2 related questions. Should Puerto Rico continue its current territorial status? And which non-territorial option would you prefer? These inquiries and the presumptions informing them are traceable, as I have argued here, to the rhetorical and political discourses held at the LMC. Despite the various referenda held since the mid-20th century, in 1967, 1993, 1998, and the 2012 so-called fourth plebiscite on the political status question, vis-a-vis the U.S., a second-class U.S. citizen still persists in Puerto Rico today. And, to make matters worse, it's perpetuated by the island's own elite political parties around the status question, and then they collapse the status question, which should be separate, with local politics. So they collapse the same election, people go in to vote for the status question, but also for government. And I don't think I can tease that out, it doesn't make sense. If you vote for independence, for instance, why would you then vote for a governor who is tied to the U.S. system? So it's a very interesting, like schizophrenia kind of experience. So these, again, despite the various referenda held in this time, you have second-class citizens still facing this dilemma. And again, as I argued, it's rooted in the same kind of descriptive and egalitarian ideological roots debated at the LMC in the early decades of the 20th century. So, thank you.
Okay, questions? Yes?
I have a sort of question, and that is for myself. If I had to decide this, I would go crazy. You've done most of the right things and a lot of the wrong things over the years, and with good intentions in almost half the cases or more. And as I listen to you, you haven't missed a thing. And it scares me because you're left out there in the dirt. Like most of us, we're not Puerto Ricans. We're out in the dirt too. And we're happy with it because we don't know any better.
That's right, yes.
I could go on and on.
But this is part of the broader discussion, the debate about ascriptive identities. I could have added, I mentioned this briefly coming in, different populations, right? The LGBT, the elderly, the young. So you're ascribed an identity, and this is what you are, and then there's no room for negotiating and spaces for true discussions about liberty and freedom, equality, and these kinds of aspects. So you may say that, to quote Howard Zinn, you may say that, oh, we are all complicit in this, even in our ignorance, in a sense. But,
Okay.
Dr. Figueroa, thank you so much for coming. You're welcome with us here today.
thank you.
I want to mention that at least here are Quakers. That means members of the Religious Society of Friends. And maybe 6 at least. I want to, what you said reminds my wife and me of our daughter. When she lived in Washington, D.C., she had a sign on her car that said, "No taxation without representation." There is a representative in Congress for D.C., but she's not allowed to vote.
Correct.
So that's similar in a way. I think I'm understanding from you that our government and our pirates, you might say, invaded islands here and there and everywhere, and seized the islands and say, okay, now you belong to us, and you're not equal to us, of course, but you belong to us. And then the Quakers and perhaps some others said, oh, these are people just as we are people, and they need to be honored as having the full dignity of human beings.
Yes.
And so is there anything I've left out?
No, that's fine. This is one of the comparisons that others have made with the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Obviously, those who live in these territories are citizens of a different sense, of a different form. But the issue of belonging is the key. At the end of the day, they belong to us, but they're not part of us.
And like Teddy Roosevelt when he seized the Philippines.
Yes, correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And let me add to the Quaker aspect. I didn't bring it out as much here because I don't have 3 hours, as I said. But that is part of the discussion that I lay out in the broader project, is about dignity. It's about looking at conditions on the ground, improving conditions, bringing the humanity. But then some of as I said, the Puerto Rican delegates they wanted more. So they also showed, as I said, Luis Muñoz Rivera showed a little bit of his, that he understood what the LMC was about in a sense, but if you look deeper into the conversations, it's clear that they did not understand also part of the Quaker tradition. And that's part of my job at this point, trying to bring that out and make these connections. That this is why they did not understand. They were looking at it from a secularist perspective, political perspective, as opposed to, I'm frustrated, you're not moving fast enough. No, because this is a process that we cannot push, in a sense. We have to allow those who are in these conditions to help us bring us forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gutierrez, for being here.
Figueroa.
Figueroa. I apologize. I'm sorry I'm late. I have no idea what you've been speaking about. I do have an idea about the Foraker Law and the Jones Act, because my mother, as a naturalist Puerto Rican, raised us to be proud of our heritage and to understand that it is not similar in any way to the imperial United States cultural models. And as someone who lives in the United States now, in order to feel connected with what goes on to change the system, because this is what I aim to do with education, to attempt to enlighten the corrupt models and the poor education in this country. But I have a question that goes back to the misuse and appropriation of the word American, which is something that is hurtfully offensive for all of us south of the border of the United States. And also it goes into the absence of a linguistic better term for the demonym of UCN or those of the United States who are born here. By default, the absence of the demonym or patronym for those born in the United States continues to perpetuate this sore. Edward Said, in Orientalism, and throughout his work and his academic endeavors, he made it a point that the word Orientalism, Orientals, was outside the scope of civilized society, in English language at least. However, we have not gotten rid of American for United States, and we have not gotten rid or addressed the issue of Latino and Hispanics, because I don't think I have anything Latin in me, and I have nothing as a Puerto Rican or Boricua. I have nothing to be, other than my mother tongue, nothing else to be too grateful to the Spaniards who sold the island to the empire. Could you please address and give me your thoughts? And also, I wanted to know, where else are you speaking during your stay in Gainesville? Because I would like to go to another of your lecture. I hope this is not the only lecture you're giving in Gainesville. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Actually, I teach a course for juniors and seniors at Ithaca College called The Politics of U.S. Citizenship. And I would like you to maybe fly up and sit in. Because this is rich, this is part of I will be integrating more of a Puerto Rico case into that. But you hit so many issues that I also try to bring out in this work. Language is key. This is why I use the word rhetoric here for a purpose. You may or may not know the name was changed twice. Puerto Rico, P-O-R-T-O, because the Anglo, whatever you know, at that time did not pronounce Puerto Rico. Like you know, so it's like Puerto Rico. So they changed it through legislation and then changed it back to reflect the island's name. And then the island's name, of course, it becomes an issue. You look into the indigenous roots, the Boricua, the original name from the Taínos and others. But yes, the language issue is key. The debate about what it means to be an American is another one. What is an American? And I also bring that into the discussion. So I try to focus more on Americanness means something that relates to the Constitution, in a sense. As Michael Walzer has said, the political theorist, in many ways, he says that there is no United Statesers. You're not going to walk around and say, I'm a United Stater. So the appropriation of the word American also plays a part in empire, the roots of imperialism in this sense. So this is part of, there's so many things to say about this. I was born on the island, raised in New York City and New Jersey. So I have an awareness on as far as the island. And it's funny because my citizenship changes if I move to Puerto Rico. It's based on residence. So I become a statutory citizen if I go and move on the island. So then I won't be able to vote for the president, I won't become a Congress member to vote for, and become a lot of things. But then I'll just change again and go back to the 50 states plus the other. Where the states is.
I have two questions for you. The first is, could you explain the subtleties of the differences between statutory citizenship and constitutional citizenship? And the second is, what was the outcome of the referendum in 2012 on what Puerto Rico would do?
Yes, actually, a new documentary just came out called The Last Colony. A director from a young Ithaca College alum, Puerto Rican, who was able to get funding from various sources. And he basically, his documentary follows the entire 2011-2012 process on the island, in the US Congress. He interviewed politicians, he interviewed various speakers from the various positions, from the status positions, Commonwealth, status quo, independence, among others. So it's a very, very good documentary. Well, let's see, the first question is the distinction, 14th Amendment, meaning that you become a birthright citizen of the 50 states. Which then,
The subtleties of difference.
the subtlety is that you do not have full constitutional rights as a statutory citizen. Congress, because it's a statute, Congress has all the authority, as opposed to the Constitution, which is supposed to be the framework governing, or at least the framework that reflects the will of the people, in theory. So the will of the people, meaning that, again, those who are born in the incorporated territories are deemed full citizens. You can run for Congress in terms of representation. You're eligible to run for the presidency, president. You have full voting rights. You can serve on a jury of your peers. So these are the things that you do not get as a statutory citizen. It's at the federal level, so it's above the federal level. The so-called state level, which obviously it is in the state, so everything else that corresponds within the autonomous boundaries of Puerto Rico, you have all those rights there. But again, it means nothing when you have the federal government changing things, imposing, having control over 85% of the economy, for instance. So it's control in terms of trade and among other things. And there's so many issues here related to this. The issue of loss of cultural artifacts and other things.
I have one last question. Going back to the time period that you're talking about, the early 20th century, I'm enough of a cynicist to say, okay, we have these racial issues, the language issues, on all the non-white Anglo-Saxon kind of issues, but I always say, look to the money. What was the reason for keeping Puerto Rico a substandard state?
The first reason was about geopolitical fights. Again, the same mentality that was playing out in the 19th century. It's about Spain is on the decline, the United Kingdom is on the decline, we have the Asian countries on the rise. It's a territorial battle, basically. So that was the first one, geopolitical. And then as the century moved on, it became, oh, this is free labor, we have some natural resources, sugar, tobacco, so we exploit. And then it becomes an issue with the subsidies, the tax breaks later on for corporations. Pharmaceutical industry found a home on the island later in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So it all depends on which era, but basically at this time, it was mostly resources, labor, and geopolitics.
Now, you mentioned Hawaii, and of course they eventually opted for statehood. Do you feel like the Puerto Ricans want statehood, or would they rather be an independent country?
Well, that gets us to the second question, which is, this is the first time, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the 2012 results. This time, first time that so-called statehood won out, but then that gets tricky as to what you mean by that. I think it was 61%. Independence.
This was in 2012?
2012. They call it the fourth plebiscite. But then, as I mentioned in the beginning, it was collapsed with island politics, right? The question about who's going to become governor. So the parties, if you don't know, are divided based on the status question. So they were created over time as for or against it, or well, independence. That's another story that I can go into if you like, but it's been killed over time, FBI, CIA, and other things. But it's tied to this, yes.
Okay, first of the point of part of the modeling of the status quo and bipartisan division in Puerto Rico has a lot to do with the propaganda machinery.
The propaganda machinery, in addition to the poverty in education. In these results of the Plebiscito 2012 are demonstrate strong national cultural pride that has been trampled by empire. However, it shows even more the resilience and the strength and love of culture of Puerto Ricans and Boricuas, because all this has been in spite of the propaganda machinery and the brainwashing that we are too small an island to survive or subsist without the help of empire. Thank you so much.
Well, two things. I called it a schizophrenia moment in a sense because it's related to this. If you are, again, receiving policies that are not just over time, you're also engaged in what's called flight. When the economy is in crises, since you have citizenship, you have easy access to the states. So then you have the flight. So this is the first time after the census was taken that we have more Puerto Ricans outside the island than on the island. So we used to have the majority on the island. Right? So it went down from 4.1 million to about 3.6 million, and we have about 8 or 9 million around the world. Small number in the sense, but still it's a large population. So about 5% are now spread all over the West, Chicago, New York. Here, about 600,000 Puerto Ricans, I think, in Central Florida. Spread out. So you have an interesting dynamic. So that also plays a role as to what is it that we are going to get. So to answer your question through a long answer, so statehood wins out, but again, it's a non-binding process that the Congress ignores all the time.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carlos Figueroa. We'll stick around, so anybody who has individual questions, please come up and talk to him. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.